Hi, my name is Kaminka. I head the Maverick Group at the Computer Science Department at Ilan University, and I'm very happy for the opportunity to talk to you today about heterogeneous swarms. Alan Newell, one of the founders of AI, was often quoted for saying, "You don't choose the scientific problem chooses you." And indeed, since the early days of my PhD, I've pursued this one scientific problem, which is my scientific problem, the nature of the social mind. I am very interested in finding out what are the basic mechanisms that allow an individual mind to reason about and interact with other minds. And in particular, if you want to phrase it as a single sentence or a single question, I'm trying to find out how does the one mind become many. Over the years, this is really translated into pursuing research that is attempting to develop general building blocks for robot social intelligence. The building blocks are general in the sense that they can be applied across a wide variety of missions and tasks and are not tailored for a specific task for the robots or a specific mission. For many years, I've done this by focusing on robot teamwork, where the robots have a joint goal and can interact globally, as we work or as we see in human teams. And in such teams, it's very often that you see heterogeneous roles within the teams, that is, heterogeneous teams. And here are some of the robot teams which we work with in my lab for various research efforts. On the right here, you see our robots patrolling along a fence, some of our patrolling work, formation following. Here are 4 IBOs following in a diamond formation. Some of the roles here include the leader and follower, but also which follower is following which other follower. And we've investigated different algorithms for optimally selecting such formations and selecting roles within the formations for the different robots. And on the left, you see here the Robocat team. We are the proud producers of the best Israeli soccer team in the history of the state, which is sitting on a shelf in my lab. It was better than the Humans Israeli soccer team, which made it to the World Cup only 1 time, and we've made it to the World Cup 3 times. So some of the work that we've done in teamwork can be seen here, but ultimately it's always been about distributed robots that have a joint goal and can interact globally. So we're not talking about centralized system, but in recent years I've really become fascinated by what we could do with swarms. So swarms are different from teams in many ways, but I think when it comes to mind, the 2 most obvious differences from teams is that while in teams robots interact globally and have joint goals, in swarms in general they interact locally and have their own goals. Now, I'm actually focusing in this talk and in my research on cooperative swarms. That is, robots were interacting locally, but they still have joint goals. Now, the robots themselves, of course, might not know these goals. These are swarm robots. They don't know what the state of the global goal or the joint goal is. They only have access to the local information. But we, as designers who are deploying the swarms, do have one goal or joint goals for the entire swarm to carry out. And this is what is fascinating to me, is the ability to be able to carry this joint goal despite the robots having only local information and local interactions with their peers. As with all swarms, in cooperative swarms, global behaviors emerge from local interactions necessarily. The robots can only interact with local peers. And of course, there are many inspirations from that from nature, but we're in research, we're looking at many different canonical tasks: foraging, flocking, aggregation, dispersion, navigation, manipulation. These are all examples of cooperative swarm tasks where the global behavior that we want as designers, as deployers of the robot, are emerging from local interactions. And this, to me, is a fascinating thing to look at from the point of view of social intelligence and understanding how it plays and what role it plays in swarm robotics in general, and cooperative swarms here in particular. So much of the research in swarms is focused on homogeneous swarms, where all the robots are actually following the same behavioral rules, but the interactions, even though they come from homogeneous rules, they still yield very interesting results. I'll give you an example. This is from modeling human crowds. In human crowds, there's a very well-known phenomena for pedestrians on sidewalks where if there's density, they form lanes. If the crowd is very dense, they form lanes moving in the opposite direction, so that people who are walking in the same direction actually tend to walk one behind another, and the opposite direction same. So you're actually clearly seeing lanes in the opposite directions in the pedestrian grounds. They might not be just two of them, maybe more, but still lanes are formed very easily. This is, as I said, a very well-known phenomenon. So here's a very simple homogeneous rules, set of 3 homogeneous rules for producing this result in robots or agents in simulation, where the rules is stated as follows. The first rule says you move forward until you're about to collide, and then you choose lane to the left or the right randomly, and you go back to moving forward again until you're about to collide. By applying this rule, by having all the agents or all the robots follow these rules, this procedure, you get lanes formed in the movement, because what happens is that the robots will continue to switch left and right until they no longer are colliding. That is, they're moving in the same direction as the agent or robot in front of them. So even though this model is not very accurate, it's a very good baseline, which is often used in the literature, and it's completely homogeneous decision making. All the robots are following these rules, and they will produce the results that you want to. In fact, many of the other models are also along the same line. So they improve the sophistication and they improve the quantitative accuracy of the model, but they are still homogeneous. In this talk, I'm going to focus on heterogeneous cooperative swarms, and in fact, I want to highlight the role that heterogeneity has in producing swarms that can do very interesting work. And I'll do this in 2 parts. The first part, I'll talk about reinforced learning in cooperative swarm robots, and where the robots are learning to coordinate by choosing collision avoidance methods. It seems to work. We know from many domains it works really well in practice, and we've been investigating an analysis, a game theoretical analysis, which shows why they work so well. And it turns out that the heterogeneous swarm is rational. That is, it converges to a Nash equilibrium. And this is something that is not necessarily true of homogeneous swarms in the same task. In the second part of the talk, I will talk about Asimov's laws in molecular robots. Molecular robots are nanoscale robots. They're too small and too simple to be able to execute anything other than a simple if-then statement. But by combining them and by creating in advance heterogeneous nanobots that are carrying out different if-then statements, we can actually carry out a task as complex as following Asimov's laws, and we'll talk about that later. Let me begin by talking about how game theory meets swarm robotics. So these are some of the domains that we've used in our lab for investigating cooperative swarms: foraging in IBO robots, and in some other cases also in simulation. The alphabet soup material handling simulation, which was produced by some of the co-founders of Kiva Systems, now Amazon Robotics, for simulating material handling tasks in warehouses, and repeated search, where here it's sort of a variant of foraging. Here the disks that you're seeing here are fixed in place, and the robots have to search and find them again and again. And in all of these tasks, the goal is to maximize something that is global, that the robots are unable to track themselves. Now, if you're a single swarm robot within such a cooperative swarm, think of what your life looks like. Begin by carrying out a programmed task, for example, foraging, or searching for food, or searching for a disk in the case of the repeated search task. And this is for you a black box. That is, it's something that you have to carry out, and we are going to go, it's denoted by P because it's programmed. When you get too close, however, to a different robot, you need to be able to avoid a collision. If you're collision, you're able to resolve it. And so you select a resolution method, one of many that is possibly available to you, to avoid the collision or resolve it. We'll mark that as an A. And you continue to do that until essentially time runs out or your battery runs out and you're told to stop. So the timeline that you're seeing here is, in fact, shows you what the timeline for the life of a single swarm robot. It begins by executing some program P. When it's about to collide, it needs to avoid it. This takes some time, which is marked here by A, and then it can go back to actually carrying out its task P. It then collides again, hopefully after much time has passed, so hopefully P is very large, and then again it takes some time while you're avoiding the collision, and then again another P, and so forth. Okay? Now, when we do this, of course, there's a question as to how can we select a collision avoidance method, A, for time A to minimize this time. And we know that there's many different coordination methods that exist, but not one of them is always good. So there's no optimal coordination method that exists. It depends on the task execution context, and it depends on the density and the group size. And so the idea that we've been pursuing for a while now in my lab is whether we can learn which method to use so that the robots actually learn to apply the most appropriate collision avoidance method to the task at hand so that they resolve the collisions quickly and go back to executing their program. And this is in fact going to be what I'm focused on here. So in order to do this, I'm going to actually take you through the game theoretical analysis because that is the most recent explanation for why certain things work. And I'll give you a spoiler by saying, okay, we know we can learn this. In fact, the robots can learn how to select the appropriate collision avoidance methods. But the interesting part is why this actually works. And so I'll do this by looking at, again, remind you of the individual swarm robot timeline. And then I'm asking you the same, what happens if we combine all these timelines of all these different robots in the swarm together? We put them side by side. So each one of them starts with P, and then they collide. That collision is going to take place with other robots. So at that point, there is interaction between the robots. And if we look at this from a game theoretic perspective, it now begins to look like an extensive form game. So each robot individually is executing P until it collides. When there is a collision, each one of the robots independently selects an avoidance method. Here we're marking them as left and right. And here the illustration here is, of course, for only two robots, but in the general case, there are any number of them. So the first robot senses a collision and chooses either L or R. And in the same time, and independently, the second robot in the collision is also selecting either L or R, right? Now, from a game theoretic perspective, all of these different combined choices lead to some program time for the two robots, but then to a second collision, which will happen at some point in the future, where again, one robot will select either L or R, and the second robot will select either L or R, again, independently from each other. These are swarms. There's very limited information, if any, that they can produce. And here we're actually assuming they're choosing completely independently of each other. So you repeat this until time runs out, and then the game ends, which means that you have terminal nodes here at the end, where you can check what is the payoff, what is the utility that was gained throughout the game for each one of the robots, and the sum of these individual payoffs in all the robots is the global utility that you're trying to maximize. If you think of it as foraging, then foraging the discs or the food that is being collected by foraging robot gets collected during time P, the times which execute the program, and the collisions are really just standing in the way. So the number of pucks or the amount of food collected by all the robots is the sum, is equivalent to the combining all the individual payoffs, all the individual food collected by all the robots through the game. Now, we are talking about swarm robots, and in particular in robotics in general. Of course, we want to be able to bridge this theory, which talks about utilities and gains and costs, and the fact that our robots don't necessarily know how much fuel, time, and energy they're spending, and resources they're spending on chasing after one piece of food or another. And of course, it also depends on the task. So in general, swarm robots can't actually know what are the gains or costs that they're paying, the gains that they're getting or the costs that they're paying from taking one action or another. They don't have observations of the other agents' actions or their effects. They don't have communication between the agents. Therefore, they don't even know what is the sum so far, the global amount of food collected so far in foraging. And all the agents are anonymous. So even if I wanted to tailor one avoidance mechanism to another agent, then of course the fact that I could meet any other agent who looked at the same makes it harder. However, this means that they cannot really track the utility gain. They can still measure the time being spent. They can measure the time being spent individually on executing their program or executing their avoidance procedures, because these are two states that are individual to them. Each one of the individual robots has can keep track of its own time spent on program, on P or A. And if you collect these two together as deployers, we can look at the collection of these things and look at what's called the coordination overhead. The coordination overhead is the percentage of time the swarm is spending on collisions rather than on being able to carry out the program that it's been given, for each one of the robots. And we've shown in the research that the coordination overhead is actually a potential function for the game. So if you want to maximize the utility, what you really want to do is minimize the overhead. And these two things are tied together completely. The interesting thing, however, is that while utility is task dependent and becomes there is something that's difficult for the robots to track, for real robots to track, and all the experiments that we've carried out, everything that we do in the lab is always with real robots. The overhead is something that we can actually track, that each one of the robots can track, because it involves their own internal clocks, and it is task independent. All right, this is what the theorem allows us to actually do, is show that all of these extensive for games, regardless of what the utility is, translate to the same thing. You want to minimize the coordination overhead for the swarm. Again, under some assumptions, but this is something that is very powerful because it allows us to build mechanisms that minimize the overhead regardless of the task that we're on. But this still leaves us with the notion that we're looking at extensive for tree, except that now we're no longer at looking at the global utility accumulated through the extensive form game, but we're looking at the minimizing the coordination overhead involved. And so this still requires us, supposedly, if we follow the theory, to predict future collisions in order to minimize the coordination overhead, which in practice, of course, is not possible. So what we do instead is assume that every time that we take the same joint action, that is, every time we take the same combination of actions in the collision, we're going to earn the same. So the program time and the avoidance times that it costs us to carry out the action, and the program times that it buys us in terms of the times that it buys us to then carry out, because the collision is resolved until the next collision, we're going to assume it's the same for every time we take the same action. And by doing this, we're actually reducing the extensive form game into a series, a sequence of repeated matrix games, each one of them identical. And if we can just find the one optimal selection for this one matrix game, then we solve them all. Okay? So to do this, we need to relate the global coordination overhead to something that to individual selection, to the individual overhead that then agent can actually compute for itself. And we've done this by looking at something called the wonderful life utility, which is really the marginal contribution or marginal effect of an agent on its on the swarm, on the other agents. And you're seeing here this formula, the wonderful life utility for the coordination overhead, actually involves two parts. It involves the individual times. In fact, looking at this as a ratio, it really is the individual coordination overhead. That is, how much overhead is the individual robot I spending on this collision, okay? And also the effect on the other robot's avoidance time, which is something, of course, we cannot know, but we can approximate in an intelligent fashion. For example, we can individually approximate this by looking at how much effect others have on me and mirroring this. So assuming that others are like me, then I can assume that, for example, take a worst case analysis or average case of how much I'm affected by others in collisions, and use that to approximate what their response or what their effect I have on them. Okay. Now, because this is a potential game, if we use this, the swarm will converge to a Nash equilibrium that is actually guaranteed to provide us with very good results on a global level. And I want to show you, in fact, experiments. This is just the tip of the iceberg from research that's been taken now, at least 2 master's theses and 1 PhD, and others are still ongoing. So I'm going to show you these. This is a video of the repeated search task. The robots come out from this home here, and then they search, and they have to research for them every time. They fix this. When they find them, they change color and go back to their home to report that they found this. And in these experiments, we've used WU as the reward for reinforcement learning algorithm. We've used different algorithms, Q-learning and Wolf PHC and other algorithms, and we use them with different approximators for the marginal contribution for the WU part of the, for the marginal contribution part of the my effect on the other agent, and also dealt with other limitations of the model, such as dealing with parallel conditions and asymmetric collisions. So I want to show you some of the results that we found. Of course, like I said, we've been investigating this for many years, but I want to share with you this one slide of results because I think it shows some of the key insights that we've gained over the years from repeating this, in particular relevant to the issue of heterogeneous swarms. In particular, I want to show you this graph, which is from repeated search with 8 robots, where the y-axis here measures the number of items found after the learning has begun to converge. And if you see here, the 3 top results, each one of these dots represents a different algorithm, either for learning or a fixed homogeneous swarm. And you see that the 3 top results here, in terms of the number of items found, come from the model that I've introduced to you in the previous few slides, using reinforcement learning with various approximators or various algorithms of the WLU, the marginal contribution of the robot. And the x-axis, on the other hand, measures the heterogeneity of the group. So we let here the learning take place over 2 avoidance methods that the robots could select between them. Of course, again, each one of them individually selects between them. But in order for the comparison to be meaningful, we also introduced robots or swarms. We've also tested swarms where all the robots were either fixed to selecting one of the methods, here in orange. So this is all of the robots. This is a homogeneous swarm where all the robots are using a single method. This is another homogeneous swarm where all the robots are selecting the different methods. And all of these points in between are for algorithms and for swarms that were heterogeneous to some degree. Again, you are seeing that the 3 top results are not only again here from our methods, actually are heterogeneous swarms and not from homogeneous swarms. This is a result, by the way, from previous work, which we beat. But the top result was achieved with 62%, on average, 60-some% of the robots selecting one method and the remaining robots selecting another. And as we change the number of robots, of course, these results will change. So sometimes, in fact, a homogeneous swarm can become the best, or can be the best for a particular task. The learning in that case will lead the robots to actually converge to all the robots making the same selection. But in more general cases, that the homogeneous swarms are actually not as well performing as heterogeneous robots. Okay, heterogeneous swarms. So this is one of the insights that we've gained from doing this work, and the learning mechanisms that we introduced, because it was backed up by the game theory analysis. Actually, we can show that it not only leads to good results, but it's also guaranteed to lead there as well. So I want to now switch gears and talk about the second part of my talk, which is going to talk about molecular robots and the Asimov. So molecular robotics is a relatively new field. It deals with robots with devices that really are tens to hundreds of nanometers in size, which is essentially the same size or smaller than viruses. One example, this is a very fashionable topic these days, of course, but one example is a folded DNA clamshell robot, which some of my colleagues participating in this research actually invented. It's made using a technique called origami, in which they fold DNA to form shapes. The robots in question here, called clamshell robots, are 35 nanometers in width from side to side, and they're about 15 nanometers in length. When they open up sideways, you can see this becomes about 100 nanometers. The robots can open, they normally are closed. They open when these 2 arms, which are made from DNA, get hybridized. That is, they bond chemically with other compounds in the area, in the environment. And then the clamshell opens and it exposes the payloads that are stored within. Otherwise, the payload is protected. This is, of course, a visualization. What you're seeing here at the bottom are pictures from electronic microscope imagery of the robots, closed and in open in vitro. Now, these robots are deceptionally simple, because you can think about each one of them as being a simple if-then rule, right? If the first arm gets triggered and the second arm gets triggered, then you expose the payload, and that's the only thing that they can do. So each robot can really carry out just one if-then statement, not even an else part, and not a compound end. So it's just a two-prong AND gate. But you can change these rules or you can chain these robots together by interacting with, causing interaction between them for very complex cascading effects. And we've known this in computer science. One of the underlying theoretical models for computer science is called production systems, in which is really cascades of if-then statements. And you can think about creating heterogeneous nanococktails or nanobot swarms in which these cascading effects can take place and actually carry out some very complex programs. This is something we've investigated. Now, as a demonstration of how this can be done, we've recreated Asimov's 3 laws of robotics in nanobots. Now, for a crowd such as the one, or audience such as the one watching this presentation, I'm sure I don't have to repeat the 3 laws of robotics, but just so we are all clear and are in sync about what these laws are and what they mean. I'll give a very brief introduction. There are 3 laws of robotics that are. The first law of robotics says that a robot will not harm a human being by action or inaction. The second law states that a robot will do as commanded unless this conflicts with the first law of robotics. And then the third law states that the robot will protect itself unless this again conflicts with either the first or the second law. Now, originally, this was a literary device that was used by Isaac Asimov in his brilliance to drive his storylines in his various books. But we're using here it philosophically, as this has been done in the past for typically in the ethical discussions of robots. But here we're actually asking a different thing. This is carrying out these 3 laws of robotics is a very complex task. So how can a single nanobot cannot do this? So can we create a swarm that can actually carry this out? And the answer is that we can do this if we are introducing heterogeneous robots into the swarm. The first robot that we introduced, we call the L2 robot, actually carries out the task. So that's the equivalent to carrying out the command that was given by the user. Now, we need another type of robot called the L1 robot to stop the L2 robots if there's cellular damage, which we can detect. When cells in the body burst because of damage, they release all the material, all the molecules that are inside, intracellular molecules, into the bloodstream. And those actually get picked up on, and some of the pain responses that we get when we get hit or when we are facing damage is because the body actually responds to these intracellular molecules. One of them is called the MIR molecule, and we've built robots that actually respond to this molecule and then stop the L2 robots. So these are the L1 robots. The L3 robots have to make sure that there are enough L1s in, to cover and detect damage to stop the L2s when if they cause damage. So the L1 and L2s have to be maintained in the right proportion, and this is the job of the L3 robots. And together they form this heterogeneous swarm where even though no single robot here can actually obey the laws, the population of the swarm as a whole obeys the 3 laws of robotics. To visualize this, I want you to think about these 3 robots, the L1, L2, and 3 robots, and just give you some scenarios. So here there's an incorrect ratio of L1s to L2s, and so the L3 robots, which are marked here in red, remain closed and they don't facilitate interactions between any one of the robots, and so there's no interaction at all and nothing is happening. If there is a correct ratio of L1s and L2s, then the L3 robots will actually open up, and this allows then the L2 robots to also hybridize and become open, and so they expose whatever is in them and they carry out the task. However, if there's damage, and this is the lower part of the picture here, if there is damage, then the L1 robots, which are marked in green, will activate. This will cause them to also bind to the L3s and will stop the L2s from continuing to work. So by the combination of these will actually create a situation where we are creating Asimov's laws in swarms. Now, to demonstrate this in a real experiment, we created Runaround, which is one of the most famous stories by Asimov. It's the first story in which he introduced the 3 laws explicitly, and it's also a story that's noted for having things go wrong, even though all the 3 laws of robotics are working as they should. Now, I'm going to give you a spoiler about the story because otherwise I can't make sense. You will not be able to make sense of the experimental results, which will be coming up next. But I apologize for ruining the story for you, but there are many other Asimov robot stories for you, and I recommend that's highly recommended reading for any robotics, in fact, for anybody. So it's just really good stories. So the story in Runaround is very, very briefly goes like this. Speedy is a robot on Mercury. It's a highly experimental model, so its 3rd law of robotics was strengthened. So it still has to obey, of course, the 3 laws of robotics, but it really has an allergy for danger, if you will. It's being given there are 2 rumens on Mercury because Mercury is very dangerous. Speedy is the robot that is allowed to go on the surface, and the robots really go through tunnels and caverns underneath the surface, so they're protected. They give a command to Speedy to bring some selenium, and they notice after a few hours that it's not back, and they monitor it, and they found that it's running a circle around the selenium pool, and it turns out that there is some hidden danger in the pool, and so what is happening is that Speedy is trying to carry out the command, so that's driving him towards the selenium in the pool, and on the other hand, it's also, because it's so allergic to danger, it's also trying to back away from the pool because of the danger, and so the two laws actually come to an equal potential. They come to an equilibrium, and this is the reason that Speedy is running in circle around this pool of selenium that it's trying to reach. Now, the only way to break the potential is by introducing the equilibrium, is by introducing danger. And so one of the humans goes out to the surface of the moon, putting himself in danger, and that now triggers the first law of robotics, which overrides the other two. And so Speedy comes, breaks the equilibrium, saves the human, and everybody's happy. Now, we've actually done this in vitro using a nanobot swarm. We're allowing the L2s to work, the L2 robots. Now, as they become fully active, they begin to stop themselves. So they're actually reducing their own ability to carry out the work. This triggers the L3s because now there's not enough of the correct ratio of L1s and L2s. So the L3s begin to stop the L2s from working. Now this reaches an equilibrium, which you can see here. So now the L2s are equilibrium. If they wanted to work more, then that would conflict with the L3s. And the only way to break this equilibrium is by introducing the MIR molecule into the vitro, which we did. And then the L1s actually come together and release the equilibrium. They stop all the system from working because they close down the L2s from working. So this is really a reproduction of runaround in vitro by a nanobot swarm. So now I'd like to conclude. I think the key insight that I'm trying to convey here in this presentation is that, well, there's a lot of interesting things that you could do with swarms that are homogeneous. I think there's a lot of power that comes for swarms that comes from being heterogeneous, either in the decision-making of the robots, such as we've seen in the case of the rational swarms, robots that were learning to avoid each other in very different ways, and we're converging towards own decisions in this fixed decision, or in their inherent capabilities by design, such as in the case of the Asimovian nanobots. The main challenges here are, of course, to be able to prescribe the design and guarantee something about what it would mean if we apply a design, or what it would mean if we apply such learning. So would, in fact, that heterogeneity or that learned behavior would be stable and optimal? And I think these are two examples that we've given here, both of some of the theoretical underpinnings, but also of the difficulty in creating such designs in the first place. There's a new center that I'm heading on smart swarms, funded for a number, that's going to be funded for a number of years forward, which will work on putting robots and locusts together. Here you're seeing a picture on the right from locusts running around in circles, literally, in one of our partner labs in Tel Aviv University, Professor Amir Ayali's lab. He's a biologist working with locusts, and we're going to be putting robots into the locust swarms together. The robots are being built to be the same size and general shape, and by mixing the locusts and the robots, we're hoping to be able to reach new science conclusions, both on the biology side and, of course, on the robotics and computer science side. My contact details are here in front of you in the email and the webpage, and I'm very much looking forward to the possibility of talking to you on the panel. I wish you all a very, very healthy and very interesting workshop, and hopefully we'll be able to meet physically soon. Thank you very much.